Alright, so I chose to look at voter turnout and the impacts that voter turnout has on the United States. And I was really interested in this because I think it's our right and duty as a citizen to vote in U.S. elections, and I really wanted to know how and why voter turnouts were so low in the U.S. compared to other countries. Um, and with this, according to my first source, which is titled The Reconsidering of Explanations for Regional Convergence in Voter Registration and Turnout, they established that in the last 4 years, voter turnout has been declining in the United States. But with this turnout, southern states have been much more represented than they were previously. So both the non-South and the South show approximately equal turnouts in voter registration and the voting process currently, and wanted to investigate how these rates have came to be equal. So in investigating the impacts that affect voter turnout, it led to my two sources that address the same issue in two very different ways. So the first source that I looked at that I just mentioned examined the impacts of voter turnout and as it broke up registering to vote and actually casting a ballot as two different sources. And this allowed them to establish the impacts that would have affected both voter turnout and casting a ballot separately, because impacts can be different in whether one does actually register and they actually end up casting a ballot in the end. And the second source I looked at, titled The Democratic Class Struggle in the United States, looked at the impacts that affect voter turnout, and it focused mainly on class and how the class system does affect the voter turnout the most. And so this is really relevant to both what we have been talking about in class and just in America in general, because it is our right and duty to vote as citizens. And this also discusses what we have discussed in class, because both race and socioeconomical differences do impact voter turnout and both registering to vote. So the first source that I looked at, which was the two-step process of both registering and casting a ballot as two different sources, this one really looked at and stemmed off the grounds that voter turnout in the South has been way lower inherently than in the non-South. And this also looked at how the South has caught up to the non-South in recent years. So they looked at, through this source, they looked at different examinations and impacts that would impact both the non-South and the South in recent years, and how these impacts the voter turnout in registering and casting a ballot. So through their method, they examined and asked people over different time periods, different years, different socioeconomical and educational status, and they did a system that if you did agree with the fact, you would answer 1, and if you did not, you would answer 0. And this created a simple system that they could examine. This would establish only the severe cases of impact, so that wouldn't be something that could possibly impact. It would only be very impacted or not impacted at all. And they used the data that was previously already collected, and they just examined it in a different way. So this quantitative data examined the voter turnout and for education level, race, party affiliation, and the time period to draw conclusions between the percentage of people who've registered for those and those who actually casted a vote. And in conclusion, they found that the registration rates of Southern blacks rose very sharply between 1956 and 1972, and then it started to level off around 2000. And it also showed that non-South blacks also showed a sharp increase between the same time period, and this is thought to be due to after the Voting Rights Act and after the Civil Rights Movement was becoming underway and over, more blacks felt comfortable that they could actually register to vote. But this also doesn't determine how they did end up casting a ballot, because in conclusion, they found that the voting turnouts and the voting registration was much higher for minorities and women than it was previously, even if they did not cast a vote. And in summary, they found that the voter turnouts among registrants in the South and non-South converged over time due to the increasing importance of education, union membership in the South, and the declining importance of political parties. So they found that the political party system wasn't as important to the Southerners as it once was. And my second source, which was the Democratic Class Struggle in the United States, focused mainly on the class system and how class impacts voting more than any other thing. And they broke it into traditional class system and total class voting, and this was how And they used this to provide the grounds that like class was a major thing that impacted voting in the United States, and how it was very important that to realize class was the main impact. So they broke careers into 6 classes: professionals, managers, owners and proprietors, non-managerial white-collar workers, skilled workers, and unskilled workers. And through this, they asked them a series of questions of who they voted for, when they voted, over different time periods. And this allowed them to examine how class system dictated who the people voted for, and if they actually registered and voted more than any other impacts, such as the wage gap or the gender gap. Class was the number one thing that you could determine if someone was going to vote or not. So in summary, both sources confirm that the impactors of voters stem from like long, deep-rooted systems that have been in place for decades. And despite the systems no longer existing, such as discrimination against minorities and women, it shows that the registration rate for these sources may have gone up, even if the vote actually casting a ballot has not. It also shows that the class system continues to be the huge presence in the U.S. politics, regardless of the margin between managers and unskilled workers. And so they conclude that the single most effective way to predict and look at voter turnout is the class system. So my level of certainty in this is I believe that it's definitely logical that the class system would be the number one influencer of voter turnout and registration, just because the higher class you are, the more access you have, the more education you typically have. And I think that definitely makes sense. But it's also interesting to realize that race and other impacts like that aren't as big of a deal as they used to be in the voting system. And I think it's also important to realize how after the civil rights movement, even though there was more rights and even though it was legal for blacks and other minorities to vote, that did not necessarily increase them actually casting a ballot, regardless if it did increase them registering to vote. Thanks.